they've been working on this. The city's been working on this for a couple of years. And we're going to talk a little bit about an overview of what this planning process is about, and then a little bit about the draft update that has been published, knowing, of course, it's not final yet and under some refinement. So a little bit of reminder about, again, this project overview. So we're going to talk about that and then go into each of the draft plan elements, and then about a subject that's pretty interesting for people, and that's about the growth alternatives and how that might be distributed. And then a little time to wrap that up, and then for questions tonight. So next I'll talk about the project team. You can see that we have several consultants that have been working with staff on this, and we've had lots of meetings internally and then some meetings externally to begin getting input, and lots of community engagement through various means and website information and small pickup groups and things like that. So before we get into the project overview, let me talk about how planning works in Washington State. And I'm sure some of you are very familiar with this, but to make sure we're all on the same page, in Washington State, we have a growth management law that provides and requires planning, long-term planning, for most cities and counties in the state. And in that case, the state's Office of Financial Management does a 20-year population forecast, county by county, and then that helps each county to know what the likely population growth is going to be over the next 20 years, so that they can take a shot at doing this long term. And then in our region, we have our Puget Sound region, we have some what we call multi-county planning that's done between King, Pierce, Snohomish, and Kitsap counties to kind of give a little bit more depth to how to manage that growth. So not just a lump sum, but how do we manage that through different policies and strategies. And I should say also the Growth Management Act does, of course, more than just say population, here's your population. There's lots of varying requirements about how you do comprehensive planning and the kinds of development regulations. The key thing in our state is that there are some requirements, and then there's some flexibility for what jurisdictions can do within those. The idea being that there's a balanced approach, but there are still some minimum requirements that apply. And then the regional planning, this Vision 2050, which is a regional document, brings it down to a little more detailed level that fits the Puget Sound region. And then in Snohomish County, we work with other cities and counties and elected officials and appointed officials and some public input. And then it's Snohomish County's job, like other counties have a similar job, which is to decide on how to distribute that lump sum of growth for the county into shared growth for the various jurisdictions. Remembering that the idea under growth management isn't to go build in the forest lands and take away the agricultural lands, but rather to focus in the areas that are more urbanized. So they work through all of that, look at the buildable lands report that we do periodically to identify what our capacity is in land for more development, and then the countywide planning policies that help guide that a little further than at the state level, but still consistent with the state level. And from there, then each of the cities and the county itself plan for those population targets that have been developed based on the county number, so that indeed each city and the county can plan for a reasonable amount of growth. Again, sharing it among all the cities. And then now, of course, beyond these growth targets, where we're generally trying to make sure we accommodate the growth, there's also new state legislation that provides for middle housing and for doing housing that meets a variety of income level needs. So those things are all going on. And then we're back to our city. So our city, like other cities, need to do a comprehensive plan. We've had one in Edmonds for many years, and it's been updated periodically. But now, like most jurisdictions in our region, it's time for an update. And so the state requires an update. For our region, it's by the end of this year. A comprehensive plan, of course, is a long-term policy document, so it's not a code. Code changes could be considered next, depending on the comprehensive plan, but the comprehensive plan is not a code. It does provide some general direction and tries to make sure that we have the land capacity to do certain things, and we think about the environment, and we think about and plan for economic vitality and climate and other things. So in that long-term comprehensive plan, it shapes how and where Edmonds will grow, not just leaving it to whatever the market wants to do, but saying here's what's important as we try to think about what's fair and equitable and healthy with the population and the housing numbers that we need to plan for. And so then the comprehensive plan also looks at the types of housing and the job opportunities and provides more policy and structure for that. And also the where part. Where does it go? Where do our parks go? What kinds of transportation improvements are needed? And where does that happen? Of course, we have funding and capital facilities plans that spell out some of that. And again, equity, fairness to a diversity of people's needs, not just the people who are able to come to lots of meetings, but a variety of people with different families and different needs. And of course, protection of the natural environment that we are so fortunate to enjoy here in Edmonds. But we know our environment also faces threats. And so protecting that for the long term, while we also provide for people to live and work, is important. So we're at our once every 10-year update now. A little reminder about this update. So every 10 years, and I should say that if you're interested, it's not just one date across the whole state. So different counties have different dates, but the largest growth area is the Puget Sound region, which includes Snohomish County. And so we have the first due date for this periodic every 10 years update. In that, we need to update our comprehensive plans and, where needed, our development regulations to reflect the new population growth and job growth, as well as other changes in state law, new information, community priorities, all the things that we want to think about with regard to transportation and environment and so on over the years. Now, it's true that about once a year, you can make amendments to your comprehensive plan, but it's intended to not just happen willy-nilly, so that you have a long-term document that you can count on, but still a mechanism to make changes once a year. So comprehensive plan, there are certain elements, or sometimes we might call them chapters, but they're called elements under the comprehensive plan requirements of the Growth Management Act. So those elements work together to help with the vision, the goals that are intended over the long term, and then a little bit more specific policies that provide direction for that. And all of that comprehensive plan helps inform what zoning or other development regulations, or what investments need to be made, what the budget priorities are, and perhaps program priorities as well for the community of Edmonds. We also have to submit our comprehensive plan to the state, draft comprehensive plan and the final comprehensive plan. And we do the same with Puget Sound Regional Council for at least the transportation element, because our region has to think about transportation together. It's not just city by city, each community doing its own thing, but recognizing that many of the important transit routes cross different cities and counties. So that's the basic idea with a comprehensive plan. We can go next. And the city, I believe, worked on a community vision. This reflects one of the drawings that was done after some kind of community meeting. Perhaps Navisha can speak to that. It happened before I came to the city. And if I didn't introduce myself, my apologies. I'm Shane Hope. I am the current development or planning and development director for the city of Edmonds, but I came on board in mid-August. So there are things that certainly happened before I got here, and we're all catching up a little bit.
Yeah, just to jump in, so this vision statement is developed through a community engagement and outreach process in August 2022, and certain themes were identified based on all the comments we have received. We have approximately received 8,500 comments, if I'm not wrong, and City Council has approved the final statement setting city's priorities as providing vibrant and diverse neighborhoods, safe streets, parks, healthy lifestyles, making the city climate resilient, and also providing access to the natural beauty of the community. So in 2023 December, the City Council has approved the vision statement, which came as an output of the entire process that's done for over a year.
Thank you. All right, so let's move to the next slide. And one of the key elements of the comprehensive plan, you remember, is the land use element. So just in summary, that really involves planning over the long term for all kinds of land uses, not at a site level, but in a more general fashion, so that residential can be accommodated, different kinds of commercial. For some communities, probably not so much Edmonds, agriculture, or in various kinds of industry, as well as recreational areas. So that helps by kind of planning that out, helps know better where things can go. Some things are certainly a mix of uses of housing need, or medical services, retail, and so on. Our land use element really emphasizes, I think, okay, my internet may go off and on, I apologize. So this really emphasizes this balanced approach, and there will be a future land use map that will show these kind of different areas. Again, even though some things within, say, a residential area can still have a school or whatever, it doesn't mean that you can't. But we look for a general sense that there is sufficient capacity to provide these opportunities. And then that goes on, will be translated later into any updates to the zoning or codes or the other development codes. Next. The big change that has occurred over the last couple of years for most of our cities and counties is that state has been concerned, and I will say the state legislature in particular, but others too, about the need to accommodate more housing. As we all know, housing has gotten very expensive. It's not keeping up with job growth. It's not keeping up with the cost of living. And so with these increased costs and the short supply that we have, it pushes up demand even more and tends to push up costs even more. And so people that are in the mid spectrum of income and below are finding it really difficult to find housing. And so the state legislature mulled this over for several years, but finally came up with some requirements for cities to do to better accommodate more growth and help have more housing available for people, for households. So the well known is this House Bill 1110, which requires at least 2 homes to be allowed per lot. Now, in many cases, that may not actually occur, but it's up to each city to make it possible through their development regulations. There are some cases for our city where we must allow 4 housing units on a particular lot, but that's only when it's within a quarter mile of a major transit stop, like Swift stop near Highway 99. And also then if one of those units is affordable and meets certain special affordability criteria, you could have 4 instead of just 2. We think most of the time it's the up to 2 that lots or 2 units that might occur on housing, but it's definitely not going to happen all at once. But that is something that we have to plan in for the long term with our comprehensive plan to make sure we have enough capacity, particularly for what's called House Bill 1220. And before I talk about that, reminder that House Bill 1337 also requires our city and all the cities to allow 2 accessory dwelling units in those kinds of predominantly single family districts. So an accessory dwelling could be attached to the main house, it could be detached from that main house, or even a combination if the property owner wants to do it and there's capacity on the given lot. But then House Bill 1220 came along and said, well, these things are good, that is to provide more opportunities for housing, but they're not going to help the folks that are on the lower end of the spectrum very much if it's just more single family houses, because those aren't affordable for many people in our state. So the idea was for cities to look at how they can actually find opportunities for housing that's of typically lower cost, which would be multifamily housing, where you save on land cost, you save on some of the construction costs per unit. And so we need to provide sufficient capacity for the low and moderate income levels for housing. And we'll talk later about the housing targets and how that plays out. Now, again, a little bit of overview on meeting these growth targets. You remember that about 13,000 people is what's forecast more in Edmonds over the next 20 years. And let me say, we're actually starting at year 2020 when we look at the numbers, because that was the population data that we had at the time. So by 2044, we need to be able to accommodate the possibility of an additional 13,000 people. Well, if you look at what housing units are, that translates to us needing about 9,000 total units now for housing. Now, we already have capacity planned in for about 5,000 units of housing in addition. So that's been planned in for some years. But now we need to find a way to have another 4,000 units for housing. So that makes up this total of the 13,000. So we already have 19,000 housing units. We already have capacity for 2,500 more jobs. We need then to build on that capacity to add possibly another 500 jobs. We don't think that's very hard to do, as long as we make sure that we keep land available for that. Go ahead. And then there's the housing element. So this is a separate chapter, but all of these elements need to be consistent with each other and not in conflict, but they all spell out at a little more detailed level the goals and policies for the particular topics. So with housing, of course, planning for sufficient land capacity for different kinds of housing needs. We had to do an inventory and analyze both what our existing housing consists of and also what we're projected to need in the future through 2044. And so all of the things are important, new development as well as housing preservation. Needs for improvements to serve those additional housing units, as well as regulations that help excuse me, guide how that works together. And at the same time, we need to keep in mind racially disparate impacts. And by that, we're talking about the fact that in the past, often large lots meant that people who didn't earn as much money didn't have much chance to buy or rent housing with large lots. And so we ended up with a lot less mix of people from different income levels and backgrounds. So we're supposed to move forward being conscious of that and trying to provide more opportunities that are mixed for different income levels and different backgrounds. Go ahead. So in Edmonds, what these targets amount to is a mix of housing for different income levels. So 0 to 30% of the area's median income, if someone's in that category, we need about over 1,800 units of that in over time. And Navusha, if I don't say something quite right, feel free to jump in. But also then some housing needs to be available for folks with special needs over the long term, so permanent supportive housing. In addition, we need housing for people in the more moderate income levels. These are usually people that work or have incomes, but it's not high enough to meet housing in just the general market in many cases. We need more than 2,400 units of those for our total, of the total 9,000. And then in the 50 to 80% income level, 50 to 80% of the area median income, we need nearly 1,500 units. And then we think that some of that can be taken up by accessory dwellings and low-rise apartments or condos. So we think that out of that, about just under 2,000 units can be in that category, or just over 2,000. And then there's some middle housing types that are nice for folks, but don't count as much for the full income needs, household income needs. So we're only counting a small amount of that. Now, all of this is based on guidance from the state. Department of Commerce has done a lot of inventory work, a lot of research, and provided guidance that cities are following to kind of identify how to figure what those housing types are to match the income level needs. And there's a barcode there if you want to look at more details about how those numbers were derived. And then there's an economic development element, which again establishes goals and policies and focuses on economic growth and still a high quality of life here in Edmonds. So it looks at have key concepts about our economy and the future, and knowing that we're a city that values the sense of place as well. So when we think about the economy and jobs, we're also thinking about having a great place to be and to be able to reach the retail and restaurants and things that are in town, as well as what other businesses, medical and so on, make sense in Edmonds. So there are goals and policies there. And we have a climate element. In our city, we've dealt with climate issues and a climate action plan. We've done a number of things for years, but the state is also recognizing that climate is a big topic and has set up a requirement for cities and counties to include a climate element. But the legislation for this came up only in 2023, and they recognized that there wasn't time for most cities to add a full climate element in the most desired way. So we have till 2029 to do this, what you might call the full meal deal in terms of climate adaptation, and mitigation, and lots more detail. But meanwhile, we've included an element that lays out some of the things that are important under this House Bill 1181 and are consistent or similar in direction to the climate action plan that the city has had for a while. But all of this lays a foundation in that climate element to do more in the future as we have the resources. So just briefly, in our climate action plan, we have strategies and actions for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We've got an inventory of our greenhouse gas generators, and buildings are a big part of it. Transportation is a big part of it. So those two things are really important, but they tie together because when people don't have to drive as far, when they can either walk or take transit for at least some of their trips, it actually means less greenhouse gas emissions and more ability to get to places without having to spend time in a car. And can make a really nice neighborhood as well. So those are thoughts that have gone into the work so far. Transportation element is another one. Oh, excuse me, I see we have up here the culture, history, and urban design element, which is very similar to what we have had and what we have now in our current comprehensive plan, which includes community culture and urban design. The one difference is now we've included historic preservation in that same element. Before it was in the land use, or currently it's in the land use element. So we've kind of put those together. There's some relationship there. And one of the key things is looking for a place-centered approach for new development. That is, having them be nice places to be around, and to think about those things as urban design goals and standards get revisited. And also to include and think about placemaking when there are any kinds of opportunities that the city has to provide in its parks or plazas or public spaces. So that work is being done. And then historic preservation, recognizing the importance of that also to a community. It's not just about what's new, it's what we preserve as well. And all in all, with the community culture part, we're thinking about the artistic identity of our city, the fact that we have a creative district. And so all these things are important. There's little sub-elements, sub-chapters, subsections in this particular element that deal with each of these topics, but they're related. And then there's the transportation element, a very important part of thinking for the future. We have, of course, certain roads and streets and sidewalks and transit opportunities. We've got a ferry, we've got trains and so on. There's lots of transportation facilities, but there's room for improvement for many of them. So with a transportation element, every city's supposed to think about what their land use assumptions are. Where do they have development now? What else is likely to happen in the next 20 years? And to think about, well, what kinds of transportation improvements are needed? What makes sense? Not just about cars, but also about pedestrians and bicycles, as well as different kinds of truck traffic, freight, and of course, larger scale transit. So the idea is to provide for a range of needs. It ultimately includes a project list, but first, of course, there have to be goals and policies. So the idea is that in the short term, at least, the budget and the projects need to match up. Long term, still will need more thought about the resources available for that as the costs are developed. But thinking ahead puts us in a better place than just waiting to find a problem. And then there's the capital facilities element, which is, of course, thinking not just about transportation, but about parks and about our sewer system and our water system, and but also our buildings. So city-owned buildings are an important part of this. And by buildings, I'm talking about any of the park and recreation facilities, as well as our city buildings, police, all those things. That's a part of it, as well as ultimately transportation gets incorporated into that. So we generally have a 6-year plan, capital improvement plan, that identifies specific projects and costs, and then a long-term plan that thinks about the big picture. Here's where we think we need to go for the long term. And that has to be consistent with the land use element. Can't just plan for a few no capital facilities and also plan for change in your land uses. So it has to match up in the planning. Go ahead. And then there's the utilities element, which looks a little more specifically at not only our city's utilities, and we serve water and sewer and stormwater in particular, but also what's happening with other service providers like telecommunications providers, our natural gas providers, and electrical providers, and so on. While our city does not control what those other utilities do, it's important for us to know what they're thinking and for them to know what we're thinking about for the future. So the idea is to work together as much as possible. But again, for us in the utilities side, we're focused on the services that we as a city provide, while we try to coordinate with all the other providers as well. And I don't know if the next slide says it, but we also have more detailed plans for our water system, our sewer system, and our stormwater facilities and protections. And those are separate documents that are related and referenced in our comprehensive plan. All right, with that, I'm going to turn over to Navusha, who did quite a bit of work even before I got here about growth alternatives and about the strategy for accommodating the kinds of households that we talked about earlier. Go ahead, Navusha.
Thanks, Shane. So growth alternatives are basically different approaches the city proposed to accommodate the predicted growth, which is 4,000 housing units and 500 jobs, after excluding the existing capacities, as Shane has mentioned previously. So where would it make the most sense to add this kind of growth? So that's an empty map of Edmonds. To start with, we have looked at areas where Snohomish County's Buildable Lands Report has identified the existing capacities. Then we have marked all the redevelopable parcels, meaning where adding growth or development is possible according to the county's analysis. Then we have looked at existing commercial, mixed use, and multifamily parcels. within the city limits. Adding growth where there is some level of existing infrastructure is more feasible than adding growth to completely new areas unless there is a strong attracting factor. Then we have identified all the major transit routes or transit lines. Then Edmonds is very unique with respect to its critical areas, topography, and slopes. County has already marked these areas as non-redevelopable in its initial analysis and calculations. City has again looked at these to ensure that development is not proposed on any of these areas, which is all the green color marked areas on this map. Finally, overlapping all these areas and excluding areas that do not support growth has led the city to identify certain areas where growth can be planned efficiently. So city has looked for opportunities to achieve efficient land use patterns and identify these areas and call them centers and hubs. So centers focus on enhancing the public realm and meeting broader community objectives with redevelopment. It includes a mix of retail and commercial uses, fostering vibrant, active community spaces. They are meant to support multifamily residential uses at high to moderate scale and allows for additional floor bonuses if specific extra conditions are met when the developments are proposed to gain some additional community benefits overall. Centers has good access to transit, encouraging sustainable transportation options as well. So the blue circles we see here on the map are the 4 major centers we have in our growth alternative strategies. Now, hubs, they are similar to centers, but they focus on public realm improvements similar to centers on a smaller scale. They include small-scale retail or commercial businesses alongside residential uses. Promotes low-rise apartments or missing middle housing types. Similar to centers, hubs also encourage one additional floor bonus if some requirements are met when developments are proposed. Now, this is again a topic of discussion with Planning Board and City Council, so we can get into those details later. Hubs are also well connected by transit, supports walkable mixed-use neighborhoods. Though both centers and hubs seem very similar, they differ mainly with the scale of development, land uses, height limits, intensity of development proposed, and the extent of multimodal access. With this approach, the city aims to enhance the overall quality of life while adding growth. So the land use patterns that support a mix of uses can promote efficient usage of land rather than single-use designations. So centers and hubs create opportunities to emphasize on integrating diverse land uses to create vibrant, functional neighborhoods. They help in focusing on walkability, safe, accessible streets to encourage walking and biking for daily activities. They support compact, sustainable development patterns that make the best use of the space and resources. We intended to create accessible communities where daily necessities and services are within short walk or bike or public transit trips. And they also prioritize investments in infrastructure to promote sustainable, equitable, and efficient transportation solutions. Draft alternatives. So keeping centers and hubs concept common, city has proposed 2 action alternatives with growth distribution happening in different configurations. Besides these, there's also a no action alternative for the future growth. So 3 alternatives are discussed in the draft plan as options for the final plan. Each alternative reflects different approaches to balancing growth, density, and infrastructure with the goal of guiding the city's future development. Let's look at the no action alternative. This represents current trends and policies without significant changes to land use, maintaining existing growth patterns and not implementing the centers and hubs strategy. It assumes the existing land use designations and the zoning regulations remain the same without any changes. It follows the current comprehensive plan and zoning with no new policy interventions. It serves as a baseline condition to evaluate the other 2 action alternatives, which we will be talking in a minute. So as you see, the little note says the no action scenario does not meet the GMA requirements as it does not accommodate planned growth or update regulations accordingly. And the growth alternative A, also called focused growth, prioritizes a combination of larger centers with more intensive mixed use developments, allowing for higher density in key areas, along with minor growth in hubs. Promotes efficient land use, as discussed before, with existing infrastructure and access to transportation services. So the downtown waterfront and Highway 99 areas on this map are marked as activity centers. And these two activity centers are being carried forward from the existing comprehensive plan. No growth is being added to these activity centers that count towards our growth target capacities. They already have a huge contribution to the economic sector and activities within the city. So in this option, majority of the growth is distributed among the four centers, namely Five Corners, Westgate, Firdale, and Medical District expansion, all the big blue circles we see on the map. Another point I'd like to mention here is when we say medical district expansion, it's just named after the existing district name in the Highway 99 sub-area plan. This doesn't mean that the uses are restricted only for medical purpose. Hubs also exist in this alternative, but relatively very small proportion of growth is added to these hubs, which are the ones in pink: Perrenville, North Bowl, East Seaview, and North Firdale. So in Alt A, proposed height in centers is 4 floors plus an additional 1 floor bonus incentive only if the developer provides community benefits. In hubs, the height is limited to 3 floors only. Moving on to alternative B, distributed growth. This one emphasizes a greater distribution of smaller hubs, promoting moderate growth across a wider area with a focus on more localized development. 3 additional hubs are added through community process and public input, which are Maplewood, West Edmonds Way, and South Ballinger. Similar to Alt A, no growth is being added to the downtown waterfront activity center or the Highway 99 sub-area. So growth would be distributed more evenly across the 4 neighborhood centers, the blue circles, and the 7 neighborhood hubs, which are the pink circles. The height distribution is also more balanced in this approach, as for both centers and hubs, it's 3 floors height by right and additional 1 floor bonus incentive only when the community benefits are part of the development proposal. So for both these alternatives, they're fully compliant with the Growth Management Act, PSRC's Vision 2050, Snohomish County's countywide planning policies, and the state House bills. So they aim to create opportunities for diverse housing, neighborhood-oriented retail services, restaurants, etc., establishing these areas as key nodes for future development. So the 2 maps you see here on the screen are draft future land use maps that were developed based on the 2 proposed action alternatives. So once there is a preferred alternative chosen, a final future land use map will be developed aligning with the decision. Now, what is a future land use map? Please note that this future land use map is different from the zoning map. Future land use map provides high-level guidance on general location and distribution of where growth occurs, provides description of future land use designations based on the character of the proposed zones. This could serve as a community's visual guide for future planning. Once the comprehensive plan is adopted, development regulations will be updated, and that's when the zoning map will also get updated. And that's done no later than 6 months once the comprehensive plan is adopted. If you scan this QR code or click on the link, you will be able to download high-resolution draft FLU maps for both these alternatives. I've also copy-pasted the link in the Q&A section if someone asked before. And now let's see what the difference is between these 2 alternatives in terms of proposed growth capacities. So in Alt A, the growth capacity within the centers account for approximately 1,500 units. And the hubs only have 150 units. So it's 53.45% towards the centers and only 5% towards the hubs. And the expansion of medical center alone contributes about 40% of the total growth capacity, which is around 1,000 to 1,200 units. Alternative A would create a total capacity of 3,000 housing units in compliance with GMA and Snohomish County planning policies. If you see the distribution of blue and yellow in the pie chart, which is on the left, you can see how majority of the growth is just towards the centers and very minimal growth is distributed within the hubs. In Alt B, centers and hubs share a more balanced growth distribution as discussed earlier. So centers are achieving around 850 units and hubs have 900 units with additional 2,000 units in the medical district expansion. Now, we received many questions why city is exceeding the required amount of growth. So we are not planning for more growth here. We have studied these capacities in the GIS for identifying environmental impacts. We have intentionally included these additional buffers in both these alternatives so that this will provide staff some flexibility to make decisions while choosing the preferred alternative. For example, if we have identified some environmental impacts with respect to any of hub locations, and if we don't want to add that in our preferred alternative, we would have some flexibility to discuss the possibilities around making those decisions. Same thing even with the discussion around heights. So now, having said that, we cannot drastically exclude areas as we will not be able to achieve the required capacities. So within these studied bookends or within the extents that we have already set, we can choose something for the preferred alternative. These discussions will be happening very soon at the planning board meeting next week and very soon with the city council as well. So stay tuned for more updates regarding that. Keep checking our webpage for key dates. So as I was saying, the preferred alternative will only include the capacity we are required to plan for, excluding all the additional buffers. The no action alternative is not in compliance with GMA, so that cannot be the preferred alternative. So the preferred alternative can be a straight up alternative A or alternative B or combination of something in between. But no new growth alternatives can be added to the final preferred alternative, as that might need a supplemental DEIS study. So it's up to the planning board and the city council to make these final decisions. So this is a future land use designations crosswalk. So the table here is just to provide a quick glance of future land use designations that will be a part of the final comprehensive plan future land use map. So the first column here is the name of the proposed new land use designation. Second one, land use type column describes the type of uses permitted for each of these proposed designations. Compatible zoning classification column talks about the basis for these designations from the current comp plan. So this basically explains what it was previously. And the last column has some additional notes giving extra explanation. So while referring to the future land use maps, please refer to this table as well parallelly, as this might help in making you understand details on what's changed to what. Moving on to draft goals and policies, every element, as Shane spoke about all these elements previously, they have their own goals and policies set, collectively aiming towards achieving the overall vision of the city. So not getting into details or reading each and every goal policy, but the overall structure of each element of the comp plan is as shown here. So every element has its own introduction or narrative section, which provides an overview of the purpose, significance, includes a little bit of history, past planning efforts, what the legal requirements are, what GMA requires, what the community has told us before, and relationship to city's long-term development. And then there will be a snapshot of what Edmonds is today, its current conditions, demographic, economic, environmental information. And then that leads to the long-term goals for the city's growth and evolution. There will be tables, graphs, images, and some illustrations that support the whole plan with evidence, trends, projections, and specific goals and policies that provide guidance to kind of align all these towards the land use and housing decisions we take, because those kind of lead the whole plan, and eventually guide with updating the city regulations. And every element has its own potential action items. So if you look in the draft plan, there will be some bullet points at the end of each element, which are called potential action items. I just want to highlight that these are not finalized, and city is going to shortlist them again and have some specific discussions with planning board and city council to kind of choose what we need to have as implementation measures. So these could be short-term actions or long-term projects. Now, policies versus regulations. So comprehensive plan does not include too many details or talk about specifics. It provides a high-level direction for the vision and provide guidance for the future growth. So it sets policies and development regulations, which we will be updating once the comprehensive plan is adopted, helps ensure that everything that's set in the comp plan is rightly implemented or followed. So for example, comprehensive plan policy encourages denser transit-oriented development. And the development regulations would actually specify the zoning changes, the densities within the areas near the transit stations. So here are some examples of policies and regulations. Say, for example, encourage walkable neighborhoods with access to parks and amenities, promote mixed-use development in designated urban centers, preserve historic and cultural resources through adaptive reuse strategies. So these are like high-level direction-oriented statements. Whereas if you see the regulations, it specifically points to a numeric value or a specific regulatory number. Zoning ordinances that limit building heights to 35 feet in a particular district. Parking minimums that require 2 spaces per residential unit. So this is just to highlight that not everything that we that we will be implementing in the near future is a part of the comprehensive plan. So right now we will be only setting direction on a high level, and eventually, as I said, the development regulations must be implemented no later than 6 months after the comprehensive plan is adopted. So that will be coming very soon, and also includes community engagement, outreach, and discussions with city council and planning board. So the comment period is open. We have published the draft plan on October 3rd and have opened the public comment period till November 4th. So please send us your questions, comments, and any sort of input. Are there things you like, you dislike, any concerns around any of the draft goals and policies in the draft plan? Did we miss something that's important for the city's future? There are also land use maps and growth alternative separate presentations that provide you more details on extents of each center and hub. So you can provide comments or ask us questions related to that information as well. And this could be one of the very few last opportunities to tell what alternative you're more lenient towards, or what alternative do you recommend. So please send us all this information, and all this will be helpful in making the city council and planning board discussions soon. So how to provide comments? Please visit our webpage. There are simple, straightforward hyperlinks to all these. There's an online comment form, or you can use the email address everyone's@edmondswar.gov. Please make sure that you use the subject line draft plan comments. This is just to differentiate DEIS comments from the draft plan comments. If somebody prefers sending written comments, they can also send us mail to our address, 121 Fifth Avenue North, Edmonds. So if you scan this QR code, it directly takes you to the online comment form. What happens next? So once the council and the planning board chooses the preferred alternative, the draft future land use maps and the draft plan will be revised based on all the feedback we have received, reflecting the council's choice of the preferred alternative. So a final environmental impact statement will be published somewhere around mid-November, which is again based on all the comments we have received. And at the end of the year, council will be adopting the final revised comprehensive plan. And it's totally along the discussions by the planning board and the city council regarding the final decision. And we can open for questions now. I kept answering some of the questions as Shane was presenting, but I couldn't really see the questions that I have received in the past few minutes because I was looking at the screen. Let me pull those questions. Shane, do you want me to just read the questions and we can together try and answer them?
That sounds good.
Okay. All right. So if anyone wants to ask a question directly, you can raise your hand. I can give you access to speak and we can have the conversation. Okay, Joe Scodino.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
So can you clarify for me? So with the draft environmental impact statement, the comments that are received will be responded to. Can you tell me what happens to the comments on the comprehensive plan? Will they be responded to? And if not, will the council actually see all the public comments that come in on the comprehensive plan? And then I have another question after that.
The council will see all of the comments.
And will
I
there be
don't know
response?
whether I don't know yet whether how much we'll be able to respond, but we hope to.
Okay. And the second question, so with these centers and hubs, if any of those are found to be have an issue relative, and the one I'm concerned about, stormwater infrastructure relative to its impacts on critical areas, but outside the critical area. So I'm not talking about in the critical area, but outside the critical area where the infrastructure will have an or lack of infrastructure impacts the critical area. How will those percentages then be affected if you have to remove some of the targets for the those particular centers and hubs, especially where you've used up your buffer, as I call it, this excess number? How will that be dealt with?
Well, we think that a lot of stormwater needs can be met by applying good stormwater regulations and standards. So, for example, we all know that older development in the past didn't have to meet the kinds of stormwater requirements that are there now. So there was a huge amounts of water running off without any treatment, either on site or off site, and creating all kinds of runoff into streams and other places where we wouldn't want it to go. So, in part, the new standards for anything else that's built help manage that and reduce the amount of stormwater runoff that would occur. At the same time, we recognize that some areas may be more sensitive, and so that's why there's this idea to have some kind of a buffer built in terms of sheer numbers, so that if there's are some places that are just too sensitive, even with good stormwater regulations, then that number can be reduced, but it would have to be made up somewhere else.
And that's part of my question. So to be made up somewhere else, are there tentative centers and hubs that are not being presented that could be maybe or should be added to
Not at this point.
capture?
Not at this point. For example, if we were going to do in doing an environmental impact statement, we've tried to capture what are the most likely and reasonable places to go. If we start talking about growth in other areas, well, our environmental impact statement might not be sufficient to deal with that. So it would set a lot of things back and require a lot of refiguring. So we think that with good implementation, most areas are suitable that have been identified. Again, there's still a little buffer there if needs to be some trading, some reduction of the total amount to be just the minimum, and then perhaps a little bit of trading within those areas that are already identified.
So just to follow up, if you found it didn't work relative to this December 31st deadline, if the city had to do a supplemental EIS to address the additional areas, would that would that cause a problem with the deadline, or if the city had to move into supplemental?
It would cause a problem with the deadline. The deadline is the deadline. We've known about it for several years. And without that, there are certain, first of all, I think it's in all of our best interest to make the best faith effort possible to meet state statutory requirements. This is the law. But secondly, there are also incentive reasons to, beyond the fact that it's state law, which include not being eligible for for various state loans and grants for infrastructure and other kinds of things. So if we don't meet that deadline, we're not eligible.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't see any other raised hands.
So you have chat questions?
There are statements, not questions, how important the climate action plan is and that we should not compromise our critical areas, wetlands, aquifer recharge areas, as we plan for growth.
And while those statements are good and should be made, and it'd be great for people to put them in their comment submittals, I would remind people that protecting our critical areas is vital. That's not going to change, and that's not subject to, for example, in environmentally critical areas. Now, having said that, does that mean that there's 5 kinds of critical areas of the Growth Management Act? So floodplains, or frequently flooded areas, I should say, wetlands, fish and wildlife habitat area, steep slopes with poor soils, so geologically hazardous areas, and fish habitat. So all of those things are currently protected in this city and most cities. And we also need to update those codes to see if there's even more protection that should be applied and makes sense in our city. So we have to work on that during this next year as well, not to weaken them, but to make sure that they're adequately strong and take into account new information that we may have learned.
Right. And Erica says that though we have until 2029 to develop an environmental plan, I think she meant the climate element, in the next 5 years, the impact of climate will just grow worse. Yes.
That's why we need to keep working now, that's for sure. So it's not putting everything off till 2029, but we provided some work. I mean, for years, the city has worked some on climate action. The challenge really is in implementing some of those things, and we need to work on that now while we still recognize that climate is an important issue, both short-term and long-term, in our comprehensive plan. But it's not the end of the action.
With this update, what we've tried is to acknowledge whatever city has done so far and kind of included that in the comprehensive plan as like laying foundation for what's supposed to be done later. We might need to have some extra studies done, and we need some additional staff and resources and funding to continue those studies. So as that might take a little longer, we have just incorporated the climate action plan into the comprehensive plan climate element as just step one. But we will be looking at those issues moving forward. There is a question. I don't think I understand this correctly, but we live in Five Corners area. If a plan distribution is voted on at 40% instead of plan B at 17%, where it is distributed more equitably, I think all the other areas in plan B will vote for plan A, of course. So all the development is in Five Corners and Westgate. This does not seem to have other areas determine what happens in our area.
Yeah, it sounds like the person who wrote that may have a specific preference on an alternative, and they're welcome to recommend that, express their concern. It sounds like that's what
Right.
they're doing, but certainly in their written comments, that's fine.
Numerous city documents, city council resolution, pros plan, Washington legislature budget, confirm the city's future goal of acquiring Unocal property for estuary restoration. What is the general goal in the comp plan?
Could you say what that question was again, Navita?
So they want to know what the general goal is for the Unocal property for estuary restoration in the comp plan.
Oh, I don't think that the comprehensive plan states specifically, in part because we don't own that property. So we're going to have to work a little bit more on what would happen there. I think the hope is for something that's of a public benefit.
Arlene has a question, so I'm just letting her talk. Arlene, can you?
Yeah, I just would like to, you mentioned briefly, you showed the critical area map, and then you were talking about something about whether or not they would be included or excluded in the neighborhood hubs and centers. And I think I missed the detail on that, specifically thinking about the Westgate area where just north of PCC, there were 3 lots that had definitely had the critical area shown there, but is included in the Westgate boundary. So can you just review how you decide on that with critical areas? This is slope. This would be about slopes and whether they're included, even if they're showing critical areas on the map. Just review that so I can understand your process.
So Navusha may have some more information on this, but and I don't recall exactly what that map showed, but in general, those critical areas are protected in one way or another. In some places, like with wetlands, the protection includes not building there at all. And in some places, like steep slopes, building can be allowed, but only with up-to-date modern geotechnical requirements and structure built if necessary, which makes development there expensive if it can occur at all. So there are lots of protections in place and buffers and so on. In the old days, as you probably know, those kinds of protections weren't in place. And so sometimes slopes crumbled because there was no protection put in place. But we have much stiffer regulations now, and we'll be looking at whether those need to be updated again.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Matt here has a question. Are there public infrastructure development costs associated with the growth alternatives? And if so, how do those costs compare?
My understanding was that that in all of the alternatives, even the no action alternative, there's still infrastructure needs throughout the city. But that the rough cost, and Navusha, if you have more information that I missed, Well, that's great. But the rough cost between the two alternatives is not much different, but there are different projects that would be built. Now, one of the things we don't know exactly the cost yet, because that will take some more configuration, and we'll see where the alternative lands. But there's not a lot of difference. For example, with water service. Okay, no matter whether you use alternative A or alternative B, you've still got to provide enough water for the people and households, whatever district they're in. So there's not a lot of difference there. Probably the biggest difference, but it may still not be much, is on transportation. What transportation improvements need to be made depending on whether you have hubs or centers in one place or another. The early assumption was much difference between those alternatives, and the important thing is to think about what's the right mix for quality of life.
There's a person, Teresa Hollis wants to ask a question.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. I'm specifically interested in the expected new building heights in the hubs and centers, and I'm glad to see it just described as basically 1 story higher than what's currently in place, is my understanding. And then there's that nice asterisk that says, and we could have even additional stories if there's a community benefit. Now, about roughly 2 to 3 months ago, City Council approved some height incentives for green buildings.
I'm sorry, they didn't actually approve that.
It's just a discussion. Okay.
That's right.
So for me, a community benefit means the developer, let's say, is going to put up a 4-story mixed-use building, and on the ground floor, there'll be a room that can be used for community meetings, just to sort of make something up. That would be an obvious community benefit. Or there may be some play space for the children in the neighborhood on the property. What do you expect is going to happen in the next 3 to 6 months around other changes to height limits, specifically for the green building heights? I mean, are we just starting with the new land use map, and then will there sort of be height creep in the next 3 to 6 months in the topic of green building incentives?
Idea, which means if they do this super and meet all these other things about streetscape, and to meet other requirements and special conditions, 5 feet of space in 5 feet of height in many cases, not a full story, but 5 feet in particularly with pitched roofs, to make sure that there's room for the extra equipment you sometimes need for energy construction. But again, that isn't decided yet. If it did go forward, that would mean a possibility of an extra 5 feet if you not only do the community benefits that are would be part of some other zoning code, but if you do this super efficient approach for energy and climate.
Marissa, do you have another question? I still see the hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry. I should have dropped my hand.
Oh, that's all right.
Thank you very much. And I am especially grateful that we're talking about just increasing heights by 1 story.
That's right. 1.
Okay,
All
going
right.
at Five Corners area is adjacent to Yost Park and Pine Ridge Park, both natural wildlife areas. Why are we proposing an increase of 40% in the Plan A when it is so close to what should be protected?
I don't have any background on that, Navusha. If you do, you can speak to that, and I don't know exactly where the protection area in particular that's being discussed, but I'm assuming if that's an identified designated fish or, excuse me, wildlife habitat area, there would be protections that wouldn't allow building there under very special circumstances, but maybe that's not the issue.
That's true. On a high level, we have taken into consideration parcel by parcel the affected areas, and also within the selected parcels, if there is a development proposal that comes in, they have to again go through the critical area checklist approval. So that will again be looked at depending on the scale of development or what's being proposed on each of those parcels.
So those types of sites were taken into account with the numbers.
Yeah.
Okay.
There is a serious runoff from Five Corners into Shell Creek. This could be a DEIS comment. Please submit in writing so that we can address in the final EIS.
One of the challenges in that area there that I know of, there's a lot of pre-existing development that's causing the problem because that was developed under old standards that didn't take care of stormwater like we need to do today. And I believe that some of it's coming from outside our own city.
Right. Okay. Kathleen here has a question. Kathleen, you should be able to
Yes,
unmute.
Yes, I just unmuted. Thank you, Navusha. So in response to my question about the previous comp plan, WashDOT did not own the Unocal property, but their aspirational goals for the multimodal transportation facility got many pages of coverage in the comp plan. And so I asked, why can't Edmond's aspirational goals for the property be included as aspirational goals for the city? And Navusha, so thank you. You put in the chat what is written in goal LU10 and policy LU 10.1. And I guess my point about both of those is that they don't say anything about restoring an estuary by reconnecting the marsh to Puget Sound. Both of those as written, one could assume that what has already been done with removing invasive species, you could maybe repair some of the boardwalk, and you would meet those goals. There's really nothing in what is written so far indicating estuary reconnection to Puget Sound. So I guess that's what I want to see. Ecology is working now on developing cleanup for the Unocal property, and having something in the comp plan would be greatly beneficial for confirming the city's intended, hoped for future use. We're not saying it's going to happen, but as an aspiration, I think many of us are really hoping to see something included for that.
Thank you. I'm glad you're making that comment.
Yes, noted. Thanks, Kathleen, for bringing that up. I have made a note of this.
Thank you.
Were we required to change the nomenclature for the land use types? It seems this will put commercial land use designated areas at risk.
Which area is at risk?
Commercial land use designated areas at risk.
Well, I don't think that's the case because commercial is continuing to be there
As mixed use though. So
as mixed use, but typically that means commercial and then some additional residential.
Right.
And of course, people can build all commercial in many cases if that's their choice.
Okay. I don't see any other questions or any other hands.
So we thank everybody for coming. And again, written comments are appreciated. And anything else, Navusha, people should know before we wrap this up?
There's one more question from Joe. There's a WAC that says no activity can harm the value or function of a critical area. This could apply to a development outside a critical area and its buffers. So the question is, how is this being taken into account?
Well, that depends a lot. I mean, really, we're trying to work with the Department of Ecology, Fish and Wildlife, and all of those things. And often it's been that keeping development out of particular types of critical areas and a buffer area in addition to that is usually adequate. But we could be learning more and find that that's not always the case, and then we re-examine it. That's part of the whole thing with code updates, is a chance to re-examine, and also recognizing that there may be differences of opinion from people about what is a harm or what is not, but we're looking for the best available science to guide us on that, and we'll be updating the critical area code this year as well.
Okay, Kathleen, do you have another question or is it just the hand up from the previous time?
Oh, I'm sorry.
All right, just checking.
Okay, yes, let me have a clarification question. Did I just hear you say that including anything about estuary restoration involving the Unocal property would jeopardize the land use designation?
No, I don't think that was said. I think
Oh.
that's the valid comment, and we'll see what we can do with it.
Okay, let me just add that I did ask Attorney Teraday at a previous meeting if we could include a policy statement. I mean, clearly we cannot rezone the property prior to the ownership, but I asked him if we could have a policy statement in the comp plan that indicated that intention, and he said yes, definitely. So
I agree,
guess
and that's why I said I'm glad you brought it up.
okay, thank you, Shane. I appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
So before we go, I'm just copy pasting some useful links which talk about growth targets explanation in detail, growth alternatives, which has clear extents or boundaries of each of these centers and hubs, and also the draft project documents on the website. There are both DEIS documents as well as the draft plan documents by each chapter, and the future land use maps high resolution PDFs. So please download them, and if you have any problems accessing these files, please reach out by sending an email to everyone's admin's email address.
Thank you, and good night. We look forward to making progress and taking into account these good questions and comments.
That's it. I'm stopping the recording now.
Thank you, Navusha. We'll talk tomorrow.
Sure, see you. Good night.
Good night.